Good morning or good afternoon. This is a load management dialogue presented by PLMA, and here you'll discover practitioner perspectives on flexible energy load management, demand response, and distributed energy resources. Today's session, an interview with Kim Harriman from Avangrid, is hosted by PLMA's Women in DM Affinity Group. My name is Judy Knight. I am Chief Development Officer with PLMA, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the co-chairs of our Women in DM group. First, Jessie Peters, who is a Senior Marketing Manager with Generac Grid Services. Next, Sangeeta Ranade, who is Vice President of Energy as a Service at AlphaStruxure, which is a joint venture between Schneider Electric and the Carlyle Group. And Erica Keating, who is a Principal Manager of Customer Demand and Generation Programs at Southern California Edison. And now let me turn today's presentation over to PLMA's Women in DM co-chair, Jessie Peters of Generac Grid Service, who will get us started and introduce our speaker. Jessie, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judy, and thank you all for joining. I can see folks still trickling in. And as I look at the names in the chat, I see some unfamiliar faces, which is quite exciting for us at Women in DM. So I thought I would take just a minute to introduce our affinity group, where we've come from, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. Women in DM is the only, though it doesn't need to be, the only affinity group associated with Peak Load Management Alliance today. We are an affinity group rather than the interest groups that some of you may be familiar with, because Women in DM is an identity, right? We are women in demand management, both at our desks, but also away from our desks. And we seek to elevate the voices of females and promote female leadership and advocacy in the energy sector, as you can see in our mission statement right at the top of the slide. Women in DM has been around as both an interest and affinity group now for a few years, which is quite exciting, and was started by Lenore Zuthan with Opinion Dynamics and Melissa Naus with Duke Energy. You can see here there are 3 boxes across the screen. And Rich, if you could advance, I'd like to talk a little bit about what we do. We base our programming off of a biannual survey where we get preferred activities, preferred topics, and motivations for joining, all from the broader PLMA audience of men, women, and any other identifying gender. We have started a speaker series because that is the top preferred activity that we see from the PLMA organization. Fireside chats, cozy conversations that truly run organically, but discuss really important issues in the industry of interest to, again, all genders. We've had 2 chats to date, June 2nd with Jill Anderson of Southern California Edison. We also spoke with Patty Durand back in August. And today we are speaking with Kim Harriman. Sangeeta will introduce the conversation topic soon. If we can advance again, Rich, we also have a lot of different topics and issues that folks would like to discuss. And one of those that consistently comes up here is fostering diverse teams and progressing individuals' careers, depending on where they're at in their trajectory. And so to address these, Sangeeta and I ran a mentorship program as part of Women in DM this past summer. We had 6 pairings with 12 participants, a really large showing from our vendors. So we'll be working to recruit all of you who work at utilities for the next iteration. It was a 10-week semi-structured pilot where we paired new to the industry or new to career professionals with mentors who, again, are looking to both impart advice as to how they've navigated their time in the demand management space, but also learn what newer folks are looking for in management, what they're looking for in teams, and how can we all be more innovative together. Rich, final advancement. We also like to have fun. And it's important that we keep the culture of Women in DM quite lively. So we'll do happy hours, we'll do social events. Many of you have attended our breakfast connections at the PLMA conferences. And one of the things that came up that was quite exciting in the mentorship program was a desire not just for mentorship, but also peer conversations, safe spaces to talk with folks who are experiencing similar things, both in the daily office, but also in their lives at home. And so as we think about our planning for the next year, we'll think about how we can run these peer pairings, right? How we can get more groups together to have these small discussions, and where issues come out that folks would like Women in DM to take a stand on, how we can run listening sessions accordingly. So that's Women in DM, that's where we come from, that's where we're going to. And with that, I'd like to introduce Sangeeta and Kim as our speakers today.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. I appreciate the handoff. I'm excited to be here with Kim Harriman from Avangrid. I did want to give a little bit of background to who Kim is, and then we have some questions that we've prepared to talk through, in particular, the public-private collaboration that's taking place to advance the clean energy transition. But we also want to keep this fairly organic. So if any of you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll pull those in as we're talking. So just to give a little bit of background to Kim, she has really sort of built her career and her reputation in the energy space. She comes at this from a policy perspective, although she can handle any engineering conversation as well. She really can sort of straddle both areas in the space. And she started in New York State with the New York Power Authority, where she built out just a reputation and a knowledge base about one of the most advanced markets in the country that was approaching this clean energy transition. And a couple years ago, she left to go to Avangrid. And it's kind of worth calling out that she went in as their vice president of state government affairs and in very short order got promoted to senior vice president in less than 18 months. And I think that's a reflection of just what she brings to the table and her ability to just expand her knowledge in this very fast changing space. And so now her remit includes many different geographies across the US. And she's really just got an interesting point of view, I think, and an interesting perspective on how these different stakeholders in the market actually need to play a role in advancing the clean energy transition. So before we jump into the Q&A, I wanted to actually hand it over to you, Kim, and start by thanking you for giving us your time. We know you're crazy busy, and I wanted to give you a chance to share your point of view and what's informed it.
Yeah, thank you, Sangeeta, and the team for having me today. You know, I started out, just to go back, I went to law school and I thought I was going to be, a DA, and I needed a job for the summer, and I went to a posting for a law clerk, and it was, what do you know about energy? And I was like, this light switch, I turn it and the lights come on. They didn't kick me out, which I was really happy for now. When I look back 20 plus years later, I stayed and I learned. And it's hard, right? It's hard to learn a complex industry like this, being a non-engineer. And, I moved pretty quickly to the Public Service Commission. So the New York Public Service Commission has 500 plus employees. They set energy policy that often, along with California, really moves the country from a regulatory approach to energy and energy related issues. And I worked there for 16 years. When I got there, they handed me like the worst of the worst cases. And I worked my way up. And in 16 years, I had an opportunity to do many things within the department, including being an administrative law judge presiding over utility rate cases, to walking into the last office I walked into there, which was the Office of General Counsel, being the General Counsel. So coming in as an entry-level attorney and working my way up over 16 years to be the general counsel was definitely something I will never forget. And I had an appreciation with respect to each one of my attorneys. I had 27 in the office, what they had to do, right? Because I did it. I did everything. And I never said no. And that included during that 16 years, a stint with Governor Patterson as his assistant, as secretary for energy. And when I went to the New York Power Authority, it was really a thought in my career progression, right? I wanted to go to the Public Service Commission because I wanted to do as many types of cases as I could to as quickly ingest as much information about the industry. I loved it when I was that summer law clerk. And I got that opportunity. And the thought process was, okay, I was the regulator. I was the regulator at the New York Commission as general counsel with Audrey Ziebelman when we started REV, right? Which is the whole concept of we have to move away from central, station power, and we need to move into a distributed grid. And so for 2 years, I was on the front lines of some of the major decisions that came out of that, whether it's REV related or community DG, which we called the solar gardens. But my thought process was 16 years as a regulator, you want to have different experiences. And I wanted to take everything that I learned and move that into another segment of the energy sector. And going to the New York Power Authority allowed me to still do that kind of public service, have that public service feel, but also work for a utility. You know, NYPA, as Sangeeta knows, is one of the biggest public state-owned utilities in the country. The resources that it has is amazing, between the hydroelectric to the pump storage to the high voltage transmission. It's one of the few companies that has a 765 kV line. And I worked for 5 years there, and I learned a lot about how the utilities work, how we work with customers. Different perspective for me, right? Having customers, large use customers from an energy basis, to running efficiency programs and looking at cutting edge technology implementations and adaptations for our customers to make their journey to clean energy seamless. And while there, I had, you know, I was voluntold to go work for Governor Cuomo as Deputy Secretary of Energy and Environment, and I had the dubious distinction of walking in February of 2020. And that, as many know, was at really the realization that the pandemic was not going to be something we could move on from in 30 days, but would be impactful across all sectors of our lives, in our economy. And you know, I learned a lot. Thankfully, I didn't have to do it a long time. But when I got back from that, I call it a tour of duty and release for good behavior, to NYPA, I took stock of where I was in my career, you know, 20 plus years. And I decided it was time to move into the private sector. And I wanted to find a company that worked, allowed me to feel like I was still doing public service because it was mission focused. And Avangrid, who I really was familiar with back in 2008 when Iberdrola, who's the parent, group, came into the US and purchased the utilities in New York. And so I got to know them during that transaction. And they're really a company, being part of Iberdrola. Many don't know, Iberdrola is like third largest energy company in the world. It was talking about renewables when nobody was talking about renewables decades ago. And so it really felt like I was coming to a mission-driven organization. And so I was really lucky they decided to hire me. And I was lucky, I guess, to get promoted pretty quickly into more responsibility. But that's the good thing. There is a lot to do. Avangrid operates 8,000 megawatts of renewable generation across 22 states in the US. Not a lot of people know that. We operate 8 utilities, electric and gas, across Maine, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New York. We're in the middle of a PLMA transaction to acquire that utility in New Mexico. And we're currently going to be, we're in a joint partnership with Copenhagen Investment Partners to develop the first utility scale offshore wind project off of the coast of Massachusetts, which we're going to see first energy delivery this year. Plus, we have 3 other offshore lease areas. So we have a huge play in offshore wind, huge, I think we're number 3 or 2 on onshore renewables. And, like every other company, we're looking and leaning back into battery storage, whether it's standalone or partnered with solar, as well as green, hydrogen. So with that, that's kind of how I got here. And Sangeeta, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Kim. That's, it's interesting hearing where you sit in that organization because it is global. There are different things happening in different markets around the world. And certainly in the US, each market looks very different. I'm just curious from your vantage point, when you're looking at, when you see how fast the transition is happening and this growth occurring, where do you think the partnership between the private and public sector can make such a difference? Or another way might be to look at it as between utilities and equipment providers. I mean, I'm sure you have lots of different stakeholders that you work with on a day-to-day basis in order to get 8 gigawatts of renewable power built out across the US. And I'm, from where you sit, I'm curious, where the collaboration could be most valuable.
So again, let me back up a little bit, because I think the first opportunity for collaboration that's critical is really the regulator and the policy setter and the industry. And I mean industry holistically, right? It's the technology providers, it's the vendors, it's the OEMs, it's the utilities, it's everybody, right? And what I learned, and I kind of joke about this, but you know, that saying, you made the bed, now you got to get into it. I learned that firsthand going from the Public Service Commission to NYPA, where we actually at NYPA, right, had to implement things that were required by the regulator. And I was like, oh crap, I wrote that. And that's terrible. And what was I thinking? So that's really where first partnership has to take place. You know, we have policy setters who are trying to do the right thing. Some of them come to the commissions or the regulatory bodies right out of school, and they've been there 20 years. God bless them, right? They're doing the work of the people. But sometimes there's a disconnect between theory and practice. And so that to me is the most critical, that we have to have more exchanges, and we need to get regulators. We often talked about this at NYPA when we talked to the regulator, to partner, to use this as a test bed of ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And then to listen to feedback when we say, okay, we had community distributed generation program, and we had X number of low income customers that have to be in that program. And then when we went to do that, what we learned is some of the rules we put in place didn't work. And so we weren't getting pickup of community distributed generation, right? The idea was sound, but the practical impact of having to do it, there was a disconnect. And so that's to me level one of partnership and coordination between public, the regulator, the energy policy person, and private, the folks who have to actually implement what they say, right? The second is when you think about the utilities and you think about DER providers, right? We have this, say, love-hate relationship, but in the beginning, right, when we talked about REV, the utilities freaked out and they thought, oh my God, you know, if we're moving to a distributed grid, you're going to erode my rate base, and oh my God, you know, and I think we need, as a utility community, to bring that conversation full circle, because there is so much we have to make an investment in the system to facilitate getting clean energy from where it's produced to where it's consumed, in electrifying our buildings, in our transit. We need everything. We do not have enough balance sheet, bodies, hours in a day to build a system out without integration of technologies that allow us to shave peak, whether it's DG plus battery plus whatever you demands response, active load control management. We need to stop seeing each other as competitors and start seeing each other as partners, because boy, this ride to a clean economy, carbon neutral economy, whatever number your state has, 2030, 2040, 2050, it's going to take us all working together to get there.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the distributed energy resource space, because, you know, increasingly electric vehicles are effectively another DER. And I mean, customers are buying them. You know, we're starting to see those numbers ramp up in a way that even just a couple of years ago, it's like we knew EVs were coming, but we didn't really know exactly when they were coming. Now we can actually see it happening. And, you know, when we think about how much that can change our economy, our environment, the way we purchase and use electricity and when we use it, I'm curious how you think we can get these different stakeholders to support one another during that growth.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Sangeeta. When you look at EVs, and we can just look at residential use before we get into busing and mid and long haul trucking. But when you think about residential use of EVs, I always think that we're going to solve this being a lot of demand on the grid that's not necessarily prepared for it, through technologies like you've seen, moving from your rotary phone to your flip phone to your the giant phones, the flip phones, and then now we're into the Apple and Samsung and Android devices. Technology is really going to have to be a key to effectively manage when we charge, how we incent customers to behave, so we shift them to various hours of peak, because don't even get me started on what the hell peak is going to be. I don't know. I don't know if anybody really understands where we're going with peak. We always talk about shifting from summer to winter peak when you're moving to building electrification, but we haven't really I feel like I haven't gotten my head around what the hours of the day peak looks like. Are we in the traditional space? Are we really shifting that too? So the partnership on that is going to be working with load management providers, making sure the load management providers are working with the car manufacturers, right? Because I feel like we have this little bit of disconnect where the car manufacturers are having all this, everybody's in the space. God, I just saw like an electric Mustang go down the street. What the hell, right? Jeep. So you're right. They're all like building these cars, and you cannot watch TV if you still watch TV and not stream. You can't watch TV and not see a commercial, right, for an electric vehicle model coming out. But are the car manufacturers partnering with load management companies who really understand technology, behavior? So we're building the functionality in the car itself versus trying to strap on a device at the point of charge. So really I think that has to come together a little bit more. And then we have not only the utilities, who have very sometimes archaic structures that we charge customers for usage. In some states, we've got prohibitions like New York, where we can't charge residential customers time of use rates. Okay, so now you're going to have to find that carrot that's big enough to incent a shift in behavior. And then the regulators who approve, lobby, even, propose at the legislature for changes, you got to get the regulators to understand the functionality of the technology, the aspects of the car itself, okay, this is where we need to go for usage, from a technology, a pricing, education campaign. Time of use rates in New York went away because when they were implemented in New York decades ago, actually, we did a terrible job. I don't know, I'm not speaking for Avangrid, but the industry in general and the regulator, terrible job educating customers. So when they got their bills because of time of use rates, they freaked out, and you had legislative backlash. So that's another thing. We cannot have legislative backlash on the rollout of EV and managed charging. And I don't even talk about like vehicle to grid, but we got to get the first part right. Because if you don't get the first part right, you don't really get to vehicle to grid.
Just picking up on one of the things that you mentioned, you talked about how we don't really know when peak is going to occur as these new assets start to come online. And utilities have like a really firm structure where you have to get your tariffs approved, you have to do your load management studies, all of those things. I'm just curious, how do you expect to see these non-traditional assets become a more core part of your proceedings as you move forward? And does the timing of the proceedings handicap you a little bit in setting rates that actually meet the moment?
So look, I think we have to be flexible. I think, I joke, the commission in New York is over 100 years old. And I always kid some of our rates guys when I was there that the manual that's on the book is as equally 100 years old. You talk to somebody who's traditional rates, and I get it, right? You want rates to be reflective of costs, and you want to minimize cross subsidization. Fundamental tenet of how you do rates. So it's parochial, and it's hard to you got to pull people away from the traditional thinking without creating unintended consequences like cost shift. So when we think about what we need to do on rates and the flexibility, I do think that there's regulatory bodies out there, not just in New York, but in other states, that are starting to think more creatively about how do we manage tariff setting, rate setting in a way that doesn't just follow the 3-year rate plan, you know, that you have shifts interim. And I think we're going to have to continue working on making sure there's flexibility there, because I think the pace of technology is really what's going to impact us. And we always talk about regulatory lag to technology advancement. And I think we're not going to see that be any truer than this time frame coming up in the next 10 years.
You mentioned earlier about sort of, I mean, you didn't quite say it like this, but sort of being on the same side of the table as opposed to like sort of feeling like you're on opposite ends between the technology providers and the utilities. Can you give an example of where you think you've seen that happen and it's worked well? Or maybe what did make it work well?
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know if it's spot on, but we have in the New York rate case right now, actually just in New York, City of Ithaca has announced a Green New Deal for Ithaca, which has got their 2030. And what was interesting is, you know, NYSEG, New York State Electric and Gas Company, which Avangrid owns, is the utility that provides service, gas and electric, to Ithaca. And we sat down with Black Power, Donnell Baird, and the city, and we went through their plan for technology, you know, for conversions, both conversions of heating to electric and work on EV charging stations. And so that's where, you know, we looked at different types of, okay, could we do battery here, charge it up so we're not overbuilding distribution network infrastructure? We know we're going to have a demand, right? And we know that we're forecasting conversions so we can look at what our capital investment plan is from the utility side. But is there a way to kind of prolong substantial investment in distribution by finding those technologies that can help us shave peak? That corresponds, right, to when you come home and you turn your thermostat up, right, at the end of the day, and you plug in your electric vehicle, let's say, right? That's where we really worked closely with them. We weren't kind of saying, oh, we're just going to build everything out, because it's rate base and utilities make money, right, off of the base, the investments they have. We recognized that there was no way we could build everything out like this. That would be bill, you know, sensitive for customers. So, okay, what other technologies could we use? And that was a partnership, and it's ongoing. But it was a great, I love that partnership. And we had the community groups, and that's how I think we have to work as a community. And I mean it in the broadest sense, if we are really going to hit these climate goals.
Is it a struggle sort of merging or sort of straddling this, trying to find solutions that are going to work, but then the solutions become very localized versus like a history of coming up with centralized solutions that can scale more easily?
Yeah. It makes us nervous, right? If you think about it, you know, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago, you had an increase in demand forecasted for a particular section of your network. You would plan your substation, right? And now we have to, you know, now we're looking at, through non-wires alternatives, you know, what are the things we can do from efficiency to DG to whatever it is, load management. But now we're taking the solution, we're putting them in many different places, and we're counting on the solution to work. And it's hard for utilities to you know, because at the end of the day, we have the legal responsibility under most state statutes to ensure safe and adequate service. And so when a utility is required to give up almost that responsibility to have these solutions that it doesn't control necessarily, depending on the program, that is a struggle. You know, I hear a lot in the industry about, you know, we need to get to a point at some, hopefully sooner rather than later, where demand load managers, DERs, are working with us and actually sharing control, or at least awareness, more real time of how things are working, because that will go a long way to the utility not being an obstacle, but being a facilitator, and having confidence that they're not going to get a penalty because the power went out in that network.
Mm-hmm. It's so much of this seems to be around transparency of information and also around speed. I mean, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, you're starting to see lots of stories in the news around companies that want to restart or build out new manufacturing in the U.S. And
Yep.
you know, with manufacturing comes heavy load needs, and it's you know, we talked a little bit about residential, but the manufacturing side or industrial need is, it's just a whole nother animal. And timing on the serving that need is evolving really quickly. And how do you see the industry evolving to better support manufacturing growth?
Yeah, well, I think a couple of things. I think that like others, we're looking at the green hydrogen space. We've got a lot of renewable generation. Some of it's tied up in contracts, some of it's subject to the market. So we're looking at opportunities to get into the green hydrogen space, you know, so whether you're using it for industrial process, right? Because that company also, right, has a climate goal and they've got to address emissions from their own activity to stationary power, you know, that can be powered by fuel cells. So I think we have to get creative in the solutions for the manufacturers who are now going to be called on to produce the components we need for the technologies that are required to meet climate goals. It's a circle, right?
It's
So that's
interesting
what
you
we're looking
raised
at.
that too, because I think a lot of people think, oh, if we can just install more solar and storage, then that will serve all of these needs. But there's really not a substitute for molecules yet, right? There's not always enough space to use storage to build out to serve the need. And green hydrogen could be, you know, the alternate fuel that the industries need in order to continue their growth.
Yeah, I think any study you look at of, you know, I've seen a couple of them from McKinsey to E3. When you look at that and it shows you the picture out to carbon neutrality economy-wide by 2050, they all have a power to gas element to them.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to bridge that last mile without it. And you look at even the best battery technology for long haul trucking, there's going to have to be, I think, from an energy density standpoint, some element of hydrogen use. And we want it green, right? We don't want to, you know, combat the problem, you know, solve the problem here, but create it over there by, you know, creating hydrogen off of coal and even natural gas. When, you know, we can harness the power of the wind and the sun, and maybe even nuclear, you know, depending on where you're at, for pink hydrogen. You know, I love the color rainbow that we have going on for hydrogen. But I think you're going to have to look at technologies like that. I mean, just imagine if you've got a manufacturer who is going to put in another manufacturing line or assembly or process, and you look at, okay, this is the impact they're going to have on demand, and you're going to have to invest. And you know, utilities don't build just to the customer. We have to really future-proof build. But the customer's on usually under standard procedures. The customer would pay for all of it, get credited back if there's any other customers who come and use that excess capacity. Well, solutions may be able to be tailored where it's a slight increase in the capacity of the electric going to the building, that we look at rooftop solar with electrolyzer mini stacks, you know, some of the companies out there that can produce hydrogen that can feed into a fuel cell. So it's really kind of looking at a creative, and the solution gets back to REV, right, which is looking at it as a distributed energy grid.
I mean, so much opportunity in the marketplace for every stakeholder that we've talked about, but also I can see how that can feel really threatening because it's so much change so fast. I mean, they're kind of this different sides of the same coin. You have navigated a lot of change in your career, and it's hard to bridge those two different perspectives. What have you found to be helpful when it comes to getting the right people around the table and getting them to see this more as an opportunity, and get the people who see it as an opportunity to be more sensitive to the challenges that it poses?
Yeah, look, I think you have to be authentic and empathetic, right? And that is authentic in there should be no artifice. You should be, I'm a big believer in saying what I mean and meaning what I say, right? Um, the second thing is understanding where each entity is coming from. We all have principles, right? We all have a role and responsibility, and better understanding what a vendor or a DER provider needs, and them understanding what the utility is trying to achieve. You know, at the end of the day, our companies employ a lot of people. They create economic benefit for the communities in which they operate or they're located in. Those are all good things. So when we sit down to talk, we just have to recognize that we all mean to solve and to do good things. And we all have people that we're responsible to and need to deliver for: investors, employees, the public, right? If you're a regulatory body. So I think starting there and understanding that and putting aside the past, what happened when, we've gone this roller coaster. um, I mean, God, I remember 30 years ago, we were talking, 20 years ago, we were talking about, meter service providers and data service providers for meters. And it was like the end of the end. And there was hostility. And I was a regulator then. And I was like, I don't understand why this is so complicated. And, so it's just kind of moving, the past is the past. But boy, we've got to get working on the future, because people may not, I put aside what people think about climate change. I've seen impacts that are real, and we've got to do something. And so we've got to kind of forget the past and move to the future with folks.
So how when you look at your trajectory and how utilities have changed, say, over the last 5 years, how do you see them changing over the next 5 years?
I think the next 5 years are going to be the most transformational this industry has seen in a long time. I do. I think that we are going to have to face, and it depends, right? Every state is different. And I'm talking about the Northeast, which has got a lot of climate targets. If you look at the states in the Northeast, and even in the Pacific Northwest and in California, there are a lot of states who want things by 2030, 2040, 2050. And those goals, whether it's carbon reduction, percentage of renewables on the grid, no more combustion fuel vehicles. Those have a real impact, and they have a huge amount of impact on the utilities, who've got to figure out how to meet the increased demand with bill sensitivity in mind and wanting to make sure we have a reliable system. I think we're going to get pushed into using different technologies and thinking about the system and looking. It's not just technologies that will help us shave peak by not doing infrastructure investment. It's also technologies that help us better utilize what we already have in the system. PMU devices, sensors that allow us to more closely operate the asset to the point, not to failure, but to the point, right? Where you've got smaller margins of operations because you have better analytics and insight into how that line, that circuit, that transformer is doing, is going to be absolutely critical. And that's going to push us outside our norm of wanting to have huge headroom and not, we're going to have to be smart about how we use data, and how, and to do that, we need to put as many sensors, I think, on the system as possible. So I think next 5 years is going to be fantastic. I'm glad I'm going to be around for at least a decade before I decide to go in the sunset and travel the world. So I'm looking forward. I'm going to hold on to my seat, buckle up, and just get ready, because it's going to be fantastic.
You highlighted one of the offshore wind projects that you're doing in Massachusetts, and every analysis I've seen around hitting climate goals, whether they're state or wherever they are local, uh, where possible includes offshore wind, but there have been some challenges because of supply chain constraints, inflation, pricing.
Yeah.
Do you see the offshore wind piece slowing down, or do you think we'll figure out a way to speed it back up?
So yeah, I think I did like 10 interviews over a weekend when we made a certain filing in Massachusetts. Look, I think there's a Wall Street Journal article that came out shortly after that. And I talked to the reporter, and she talked to a lot of people. I thought she got it right. It's a reflection that the industry is not new. Let's just be frank here. The offshore wind industry is not new. It may be new to the US, but it is not new. Iberdrola has offshore wind projects that are operating in the North Sea, for God's sake, right? When you talk about difficult climates to build large infrastructure like that, they've got offshore wind projects, France, Germany, Spain, UK. So it's not new. It's new to the US. That's point number one. Point number two is that a lot of these contracts were entered into at a time, even the most recent one, when we put a bid in for Commonwealth Wind in 2020, September of 2021, you didn't have, I mean, the world changed. It got flipped on its head. You had a conflict in Ukraine. And by the way, Ukraine and Germany are the two principal steel plants that produce a significant amount of steel for these infrastructures for offshore wind. You had commodity supply increases because of inflation. You had supply chain difficulties because pandemic was a hangover, coupled with a crisis conflict in Europe, which sent all sorts of prices spiraling. And we had 40-year high inflation. I mean, people will say, well, we shouldn't do this or we shouldn't do that because of the precedent. And I was like, we are in unprecedented times. There is no precedent. So do I think it's something we have to deal with? Yes, there is a path forward. Offshore wind will be built in the US. There is no question in my mind. And as I talked about, Vineyard Wind, which got its contract, locked in its supply and its tenders, is going to have first energy delivery this year. So if you want to look for the North Star, that's the North Star. We can do it. Yeah. Or do we have a little bit of a bump in the road because, quite frankly, the world turned on its head? Yes. But there is a path forward. And there's real world experience that companies like Avangrid are going to pull from Iberdrola, who's done this time and time again.
Congratulations on that project, because it is such a heavy lift to do a project like this, and then for it to be the first of its kind in this area it's significant. It's game changing, because like you said, it's about showing that it can be done.
It can be, but they're complicated, right? These are,
Yeah.
$4 billion, $5 million, complex. When you bid a project, think about it. When you bid a project, you win the bid, you get the contract from the state, you haven't even finished your permitting. And you've got federal, state, local permitting you have to do. Then you go out and you tender for supply. So while prices were traditionally going down, what we saw right after Vineyard Wood Wind and others, there was the expectation. So you always build in room, right? When you bid for price variations among your suppliers, but 100, 200% increases as a result of global challenges. Nobody builds that amount of flexibility into a bid. So we've got a lot of work to do, but there is no question the capacity factor for offshore wind is critical. Plus, especially in the Northeast, a lot of that resource is located closer, right? Even if you're bringing to shore, pretty close to load centers. And so it has to be a staple in our tool in our toolbox to get to the climate change goals we have.
You've covered a lot of ground in this conversation. And in the very beginning, you mentioned in your first job interview, you knew nothing about energy. And now we're talking about so much depth and so much technicality and where the market's going. And I'm just curious, when you handle these technical conversations, there are so many questions around the technology, around how it's going to interface with the grid, getting community buy-in to having these kinds of things in individual communities. Can you speak to your trajectory navigating and administering the high stakes conversations that have such a fundamental technical foundation?
Yeah, I've had some difficult conversations with community groups. Let's start at the foundation, right? And that's the community that hosts the project or the technology or whatever it is. You know, first and foremost, you can't go in there and speak to them in wonk speak. It just, you have to figure out how to communicate in as understandable a way as possible. Very complex technologies. And when you think about it, we've got communities, in some communities, especially environmental justice communities, who kind of felt like they've been the guinea pigs for some of this stuff, or rightfully so, disproportionately impacted by industry. Those communities are the ones most concerned. Hydrogen is a great example, right? And so you have to, one, be a good listener, be empathetic to their concerns, the impacts that they may have experienced in the past, and you have to bring them along in the education on the technology, and be willing to take them on tours, be willing to do extra studies that they have a say in the scope of the study, in the selection of the vendor who does the study. So you really have to stretch. Where in the past, I think sometimes we just plan and then we'd permit and then we'd implement and we'd operate. That era is gone, especially for new technologies. Batteries are no different. People used to say, oh, we have like, could they explode? Do firefighters understand how to put them out? Is it emitting some frequency in the community that will impact, my health? So we have to do more work on engaging them early and often, and we need to bring the message down. But let me just start for the first thing we need to do is go in and listen. You can't go in and tell a community, I got a great project for you. You got to go listen, and you got to tailor your project to meet their needs.
How has the quality of that conversation changed now that social media is so present? And I mean, whenever new technologies come out, there's lots of conversations, sometimes misplaced, around the health impacts of a windmill down the street or a smart meter or whatever it might be. And a lot of that information can spread through new resources. How do you manage that and still keep communities on side?
Yeah. So let's talk about whether or not that's I have this conversation with my kids now, and sometimes with my dad too, right? So it's great, right? That's spectrum, my 80-year-old father and my 14-year-old daughter. And I say, not everything you read online is true. And we're so used to getting information from a medium of television, where before we got into certain stations versus certain stations, but an outlet that we trusted, right? That was the information, because there were so few people who did it, and we called them professionals. They were professional journalists. And then we moved into this era where anybody could be an expert, and they put it online. Not a lot of people fact check it, depending on the platform you're on, but people still take it as almost fact. And so you have to have a strong, and this is the comms piece of me coming out, you have to have a strong communications plan day one. And you need to geo-target. Folks know what that means. You need to get to the vicinity, the audience, so to speak, on the social platforms of where your project is early. And you need to communicate. And depending on your demographics, you're not going to communicate the best way through a paper. You're going to communicate, and by the way, think about your kids. They have like a attention span of a freaking gnat now. So you're doing like 30, 60, 90-second reels on Instagram, right? Or videos or quick imagery, because you've got a very short. So not only do you have to pick the right platform, you got to get out there early and manage the message. And we should not be afraid to engage in digital discourse. Everybody posts comments, and the next thing you know, everybody now believes that you will turn neon green if you're next to a battery, right? Or you need a tinfoil hat if you're next to an AMI device, for God's sake. So but if you let that chatter go on in the social sphere without having people that will engage to correct the narrative, you can get derailed very quickly. So companies have to start thinking about not just I'm going to pay for a social ad, but I'm going to get organizers to go out and engage with the chatter.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the faster this stuff moves, the more misinformation can be out on social media, because it's just new, people are still getting their head around it, and and like you said, they will get information from resources that just may not be well informed.
It's like it's like a hotbed for urban myth. You know, when you think about it, it's like, it becomes, like, oh, anyways, so I'll stop.
So we are starting to hit up against time. So I want to ask you one formal last question, and that is, what excites you most about what's coming next?
Everything. I know it's so weird because I get so excited about this stuff. My kids are like, "What is wrong with you?"
Mine too.
Yeah. So a little bit of the unknown. I mean, we are we're 100+ year old, more than that, right? When you think about the first, Edison and the New York City system, we are an old industry in general, the supply of electricity to people and businesses. But we are going to see in a very short period of time the most transformation of our industry. And I don't know all that it'll bring, but I know it's going to be one hell of a ride. And I know that we need to have everybody not only passionate, but dedicated to finding a solution, because too much rides on not. And we can't spend time or waste time just fighting. We got to figure out the solution. We got to apply it. If we fail, okay, we fail fast and we move on, because it's a decade ahead of, I mean, this is the decade. We're going to have to make this happen. So yeah, I'm excited for it. I know it's going to be hard work, but I'm excited.
And to people who are still learning about the industry and coming up to speed on all this change, any good reads that you would recommend, or good podcasts that you think they should listen to?
Read everything.
Mm.
I'm not kidding you. Some of the issues I took on early in my career, I had no reactive power. Who the hell knew what reactive power was? And I was like signed, like writing policy paper to FERC on reactive power. But you find the people who will educate you. It's not always the reads, right? You can go out and Google your list of the best books to read, but find the people who have lived through the journey and transition, understand their experiences, do your research yourself as much as you can, and don't be afraid to ask questions. That's how I learned. I used to bug the hell. People like run the other way from me at the department when I was a young attorney. And be like, oh no, that girl's coming again with like 5 million questions. But that's how I learned. And I never said no to an assignment. So I did all kinds of assignments, all kinds of projects to build out my base of knowledge. And I learned, the best thing about this job is I learned something every day.
Mm. Yeah, it's great. And I appreciate the time that you've given us, and just the level of passion you bring to what you do. It's so nice to hear and see someone within the industry that's not just making the change happen, but really advocating for it. So thank you, Kim, and we really appreciate your time. And now I will flip it back to Judy.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And thank you so much, Kim, for joining us today. This has like just been such an interesting and compelling conversation. We really appreciate you being with us and sharing your thoughts. So wonderful, interesting past, and I'm excited that you're so thrilled about what's coming up in the future. I think that bodes well for all of us. So let's quickly make some closing announcements. First of all, I want to let everybody know that this discussion will also be available through PLMA's Load Management Dialogue podcast, which you can download from wherever you get your podcasts. Second, we also encourage you to take a look at PLMA's website, where you can access our Load Management Resource Center. And that's our shareable, searchable content library of webinars and publications and conference sessions and a whole lot more. It's available to everyone, and we will be posting a recording of this session there so you can rewatch it. Last couple of things to be aware of. PLMA has another load management dialogue coming up next Thursday, January 26th. And this is another exciting one where we'll be highlighting trends to watch in 2023 with 2 energy experts, one of whom is with Utility Dive, who's just finished writing a very interesting paper on that particular idea and thought process for the year ahead. Second, if you're going to plan on being at Distributech in early February in beautiful San Diego, please join PLMA for breakfast. If you are a PLMA member, we're having a really nice breakfast event on Tuesday morning. It happens before the keynote, so you'll have a chance to drop in, say hello, and get a chance to touch bases with some old friends and colleagues. Next point I want to make is many of you have been asking about PLMA's upcoming annual awards, and we will be opening the nominations for awards starting on February 2nd. So that is just around the corner. We'll be recognizing programs and technology implementations and thought leadership from the year 2022. So be aware that that's coming up very shortly. It will be publicized in all of our usual newsletter formats. And last of all, I want to invite everybody to save the date for PLMA's 47th conference coming up in May in Memphis, Tennessee. That's it. We will see you again soon, and thank you everybody for joining us today. You've been listening to a load management dialogue presented by PLMA. To learn more about upcoming dialogues and for an archive of past recordings, visit us at peakload.org or your favorite podcast platform. This concludes this edition. Thanks, everybody, and see you soon.